For this next video series, I thought I would actually video record the reassembly of the top end of my KZ650, which you see next to me here. This motor was profiled in an earlier video whereby I showed in a series of steps of disassembly. Well, now I'm preparing to put it back together, and I thought some folks might be interested in seeing the process, literally the process of putting it back together, starting with the cylinder block, then mounting the head, getting the cams in place, and getting it timed, getting cams timed, and getting it restarted. So this will be a bit of an ongoing series. I'm going to start first with discussing the current condition of the engine and some of the things that one has to be aware of as they're preparing to put this relatively complex top end back together. As I had illustrated earlier, it's a double overhead cam arrangement, and one has to pay particular attention to getting the cams timed properly. That's for the valve timing as well as, of course, the ignition timing. So after this little intro piece, I'll get into discussing some of the details around the block as it exists now, and then we'll get into mounting the block versus cylinder, which is all one piece, and then we'll move on from there. So stay tuned. Here's a close-up of the engine as it currently exists. I'm just preparing to put the block back on, as I alluded to in the previous clip. The engine's already been cleaned. Actually, I had pistons off. Each one of the pistons I removed. They're full of carbon, and you can see the numbers here that I wrote on with a Sharpie so I could keep track of what piston came out of which position. You'll also notice the arrow right here, which indicates that it should always point to the exhaust, or in other words, the arrow points to the exhaust is what that indicates. Notice the rubber bands I've used here underneath. That's to keep the on the outer cylinders anyway, because I had to crank the engine over, turn it over gently to keep the from flopping back and forth. It's a technique I commonly use. I haven't used any in the middle because those were at top dead center earlier and just kind of eased down. So the pistons have been each removed and cleaned, removal of the carbon. I did pull the top ring off of the number 1 cylinder, which is on the far left, the number 4 cylinder here, or piston. I pulled the top ring off, inserted it into the block, and measured the ring end gap to make sure it was within manufacturer's tolerance, and it was. So I'm not replacing the rings. I cleaned the ring grooves as part of the cleaning of the top of the pistons, and then I remounted the pistons with their original wrist pin and circlips, as you can see here. I'm a big believer in assembly lube, which is a very thick, viscous product that's required, or used rather, specifically for reassembly. In fact, you can see a bit of it on this piston right here. In this context, I used it when I put the wrist pins back in, and assembly lube is really used to assist with cold startup of a fresh rebuild, a fresh reassembly, which this obviously is. And it's being very viscous, it clings well, and it assists with lubrication until the engine itself can take over and start pumping. In this case, it's a 4-stroke. It'll start pumping oil on its own. So I'm very liberal with assembly lube, and when I drop the cylinder block over, you'll see more use of assembly lube to lubricate the rings and the pistons, and that'll be in a later segment. When I pulled the block off originally, a lot of the base gasket, which fits here between the mouth of the block and the bottom of the cylinder, a lot of it had been left behind, so I had to be very judicious about cleaning it. It's been cleaned very, very well. I took probably a total of a couple of hours. I'm not sure if someone's been in this engine before. It showed a little evidence of having been tampered with. You can see a little bit of it right here. That I did not do that. It looks like someone might have been in here, but I don't know for sure. But in general, the condition of the block here is quite good. It cleaned up really well. As I indicated, I took quite a bit of time to make sure that was perfectly clean, and I will clean it again with acetone on a clean shop cloth before I remount the base gasket and drop the cylinder block down over the pistons. So this has to be cleaned very well. You'll notice a port here, and there's a companion or matching one on the left side. This is an oil port. There's a little oil O-ring, black O-ring around it. Those have been cleaned. I've removed them. Those are removable. The O-rings themselves I have not replaced yet, though I do have new ones. So I'll be replacing the O-ring itself, but the port has already been cleaned. That's the oil passage to the top end of the motor to get oil to the cams. You'll see here in the middle, let's see if I can reposition a little bit for you, get you a little bit better shot of. You'll see the chain. This is the cam chain that drives the overhead cams. There's an idler here in the middle. I've got to replace these rubber blocks here. They're hard to see from this perspective, but there's two rubber blocks. They're very hard right now. They're hardened from age. I do have those. Those will be replaced. The cam right now I have in an up position and to get it up out of the way, and eventually when I go to put the block on, I'll have to fish the cam chain up through the middle of the block so that when I go to put the cams back in, I have to slide the cams through the chain in a fashion similar to this. Right now what I've done, and this is a technique that I've used before, reposition here a bit, on an engine such as this one, though I've never had this engine apart before, I've used this technique before. I took a piece of copper, or rather brass, I should say, brass tubing. This is just soft brass. Buy it at hobby shops, craft shops, that kind of thing. I keep this material around in different shapes and sizes. And simply what I did is I slid it through the chain and it was resting on each side on the frame tubes here. So the chain actually loops around this brass tube to keep it up and out of the way. And as I turn the motor over, it's one less thing I really have to worry about, and that is the chain bunching up or being loose as I have to reposition the engine, such as when I brought each piston up to remove it, I had to gently turn the engine over. And this allows the chain to slip on that brass tube with no real wear. And it was clean. I cleaned it very well, cleaned everything up in here before I put it together so I'd have no debris falling down. And it works really well because it slides around that copper tube or brass tube really well. So this is an endless chain, by the way. There's no master link in it. I am not intending to replace the chain. This engine, as best I can tell according to the mileage, has about 17,000 miles on it, which is not a lot for an engine of this type. These are a very durable, well-made, well-engineered engine, and 17,000 miles on an engine like this is nothing. And in order to replace the chain, I would have two options. One is I would have to either split the engine apart, literally I'd have to get down into the bowels to get the crankshaft to put a new chain on. The other option is I would break this chain, remount another chain, a new chain with a master link, which I understand people have done. I'm not wild about master links on cam chains, but it's probably a viable option. I've never done it. Or I would mount a chain with a master link and then go back and replace the master link with a permanent link by peening or riveting it over. I don't believe that's necessary on this engine based on the relatively low miles. The cam chain is in good shape, and so I'm just going to reuse it and not go through all that effort. I don't think it's really necessary on this engine, particularly since the pistons were within operating tolerance, the rings are well within operating tolerance. The engine doesn't really show significant wear, so I have really no reason to believe I have to do something serious with the chain, so I'm going to go with it. So the next steps will be I have to replace the O-rings on each side for these oil passage ports. I'll clean the base here really well with acetone once again. Generally make sure everything's clean, and replace the little rubber blocks that this idler wheel rests on before I move on to preparing the block for some tuning that I need to do in a similar fashion to prepare the block to mount back on the base of the engine here. Okay, I pulled these orifices
underneath the blue tape. I just have it taped right now to keep them clean. I pulled the orifices, they came up, they just pop out. They're not even a friction fit. Cleaned them, cleaned the passage down into the block, blew it out, make sure it was clean. Both of them were, but I blew them out anyway. And replaced the O-rings, this black O-ring you see here. So that's been done on both sides. I didn't record that because it's pretty elementary. I also replaced the black rubber blocks that sit down in here. There's one on each side of this cam chain idler wheel with new ones. Here's the originals that I pulled out. See if we can get a good shot of that. They sit in there something like that on each side of the axle, essentially, or the shaft that this idler wheel rides on. It's always a good idea on these engines to replace the rubber gaskets, O-rings, that kind of thing. They get very hard with age and brittle. These are very hard. You can probably hear that when I tap them together. They're actually just as hard as almost a rock. The new ones are very soft. They're brand new. They're still available from Kawasaki. In fact, many of the parts are still available brand new from Kawasaki, not even new old stock. You can buy them new. So these rubber blocks were replaced with the new ones, and they're actually very soft, as one would expect. I don't know if the camera will pick it up or not, but there's actually a little, it's embossed as up, UP. So obviously they want you to install that up, which I did, and they sit in there like that. I put a little dab of grease on the bottom of each one of them when I drop them in, just to hold them in location so they don't, for some reason, pop out easily on me. And again, I've already cleaned and prepped the orifices, the oil feed orifices. They basically act like a doll also to locate the cylinder. The O-rings. My next step will be to clean the block face one more time. I'll bring the center two pistons up to top dead center as I'm preparing to mount the cylinder block. But before I get to that, I have to prepare the base gasket, which I'll show on a video here in just a moment. And obviously put that down first and pull the tape off before I go much further.